spiritual portrait of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. Today on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of Saint Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Sister Betty Ann McNeil of the Daughters of Charity. She has newly edited and provided the foreword of the second edition of the classic spiritual portrait of Mother Seton, entitled Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, a spiritual portrait. You can find it and pick it up by going to Ignatius.com or visit your Catholic bookstore, wherever you find books as well. But the publisher, Ignatius.com, is a great place to go. This updated edition of the acclaimed spiritual work is being released to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the canonization of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was declared the first native-born American saint by Saint Pope Paul VI in 1975. So the 50th anniversary of the canonization is coming up real quick on September 14th, the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, also called the Triumph of the Cross. Very appropriate for St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, but we're very blessed to have Sister Betty Ann McNeil with us. Sister, welcome to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm just fine and delighted to be with you.
Very excited to dive into the content of this book with you. But first, I do want to let folks know, if you are enjoying listening to The Simple Truth and other great shows that are broadcast on the Station of the Cross, we do ask you to please support our 2025 Fall Appeal. Many easy ways to donate. You can simply return the envelope from our recent mailing, or you can go to thestationofthecross.com or use the iCatholic Radio mobile app. You can also call in your pledge weekdays, 8 to 5 p.m. Eastern at 1-877-711-8500. We thank you for your generous support. All right, so Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. Again, this is edited by Sister Betty Ann McNeil, who is with us today. And Sister, I'd like to start just by asking you, this is an incredible project, getting involved in all of this. In fact, this is the only in-depth treatment of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's relationship with God, based on archival documents and 30 years of research, study, meditation, writing, and lecturing by the author, Father Joseph Dirvin. How did you get involved in this project?
Well, I knew Father Dirvin, and I remember the day he walked into our provincial house on his way to the archives to begin this long-awaited project. There was no text of this nature. Subsequently, he is with the Lord, and so much more information has come out. The Elizabeth Seton collected writings has been published, and his footnotes are totally outdated because of that. So I was asked if I would consider updating the footnotes to correlate with the published writings, for the sake of the reader who might be interested in looking at the total context of a particular quote. And this book is not a biography, but a study of her spiritual development. So it's not something one picks up and reads and puts down. It can be a companion for prayer for many years.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was my experience of it for sure. This is incredibly rich. For me, it was an introduction to the writings of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. I've been familiar with her. I remember visiting one of her places that she was, I guess it would have been the Episcopal community church that she used to be a part of in New York City. I remember visiting that, taking a tour of that when I was there some years ago. And then certainly Emmitsburg, where her remains lie, where you can go to her tomb today. I believe on a road trip, I remember stopping in there some years ago and spending some time in prayer. And also even, a parish that we were at some years ago, named after St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, even added her as a patron, as a middle name to one of our daughters. So I've been familiar with her, but without reading her writings, I mean, just knowing the narrative of her life is one thing, and there's a lot there. But once you start reading the writings and really starting to understand who she was and what she was like and what her spirituality was like. It's just absolutely incredible and edifying and wonderfully refreshing to get to know really a saint that maybe you hadn't known much about, but that really deserves to be known in her writing. So thank you so much for you and Ignatius Press for lifting up these writings, lifting up this work of Father Dirvin. Anything else that you want to share just about the nature of this book, in particular, as far as when did you first read it and what has been the influence on you personally?
Well, I feel like I grew up with Elizabeth Seton because as a youngster, I signed a petition for her canonization. I was here on the holy grounds of Emmitsburg at the time of her beatification, and I was in Rome for the canonization. So I read this book when it first came out, and I had read previous biographies, etc. It's always been a source of inspiration, particularly how she revered the Holy Eucharist as the real presence of God and her sense of seeing God in the person she was serving. And the fact that even through her spiritual roots are definitely in the Episcopal tradition, the Episcopal Church. That's the roots of her sanctity. She learned about Psalm 23. She was very imbued with what is God's will and doing God's will. And she relied on divine providence to take care of her. She went through many rough times, from early childhood loss of her mother, her baby sister, alienation from her father, etc., living in a blended family with marital conflict. She's a woman who overcame many obstacles, but she went forward with grace. So she's inspired me to face life and deal with what life provides, the challenges, knowing that God will provide and God is leading.
Yes. Yeah. And that really does come out in her spirituality on the will of God for sure. That was one of the aspects I found very refreshing, and because she is one that this really does come out. We can talk about this some as we go, about her love of God and therefore her love of God's will, her preference to do God's will above all else. Now, this is something we certainly do find in many saints, if not all the saints, right? They love to do God's will, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard, knowing with the knowledge, because they know who God is, that he is all loving, all good, all knowing, and that he knows best and he has the best. And even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, that's going to be the best way, whatever his will is. So to be surrendered, to be open, to be available to whatever that will is, but her very much bringing that down into the practical and saying, so the duties to my state in life. And this is very interesting because we have a difference in her story that is much different than many Catholic saints, because she is not only the first native-born canonized saint of the U.S. And the foundress of the first American apostolic community, but she was also a laywoman for 34 of her 46 years, and a Protestant laywoman for 30 of them, and a wife and a mother and a widow. So she lived a very full life in her 46 years. Anything else regarding her narrative that really jumps out to you as something to present early on to anyone who might be rather unfamiliar with her?
I think you covered many of the key aspects, but for me, she seems to be a woman for all seasons, a woman for all people, a person for all people. She experienced what so many people today are struggling with, whether it's parenting, inculcating values with their children, helping children to go through the emotional roller coasters of adolescence, etc., or struggling with loved ones who are ill, terminally ill. Her example of compassion is something that is little written about, but is effusive. And her spiritual director, after she died, said that was really her primary characteristic, was the compassion that she showed to others. whatever crisis people are dealing with today, she could be a model. She is a role model for life, for how to live a life of faith in the midst of the world, or how to respond to God's call to live a consecrated life. She's also an intercessor in heaven for anyone who has a need or a desire for grace. She can intercede with God for that. And we know she's done that through the several miracles that were attributed to her. And I believe there are many other miracles that have never been recorded, that are only in oral history, shall we say.
Yes, Sister Betty Ann McNeil is with us. We're talking about the book, Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, A Spiritual Portrait, the second edition of which is newly released by Ignatius Press, ignatius.com. And wonderful work. And, so she was a wife and a mother, also a religious mother to many. And yet, Elizabeth herself, she lost her own mother. Her mother died when she was very young, when she was 2. And then, on this feast day today, it's the birthday of Our Lady, the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I think it's appropriate to lift this up. This is at the time of her conversion to the Catholic Church. And her first coming across the Memorare. Listen to this. It says, a little prayer book was on the table. I opened to it. This is Elizabeth's writings now. I opened to it a little prayer, the Memorare of St. Bernard to the Blessed Virgin, begging her to be our mother. And I said it to her with such a certainty that God would surely refuse nothing to his mother, and that she could not help loving and pitying the poor souls he died for, that I felt really I had a mother. We'll pick up there when we come back, but this reminds me of St. Therese. This reminds me of St. John Paul II. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Sister Betty Ann McNeil. She has newly edited and provided the foreword of the second edition of the classic spiritual portrait of Mother Seton, entitled Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, A Spiritual Portrait. You can find it now, gearing up for the 50th anniversary of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's canonization, which is coming up just next week, September the 14th. Whenever you hear this, if you're hearing it live, certainly it's a great time to get this book. But at any point, this is a book worth having and worth getting to know more deeply St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Again, you can find it at ignatius.com, ignatius.com. And before we get back to our discussion, I do want to let you know that if you are buying or selling a home, there is an easy way to help the Station of the Cross at the same time. Real Estate for Life has 1,400 experienced, morally grounded agents in the U.S. and Canada. Visit realestateforlife.org to find a Christ-centered, experienced realtor near you. And don't forget to mention the Station of the Cross. All right, getting back to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, lost her mother at the tender age of 2. Saint Therese, I believe, lost her mother at around the age of 4. Pope St. John Paul II, I think, around the age of 8. And each of them having a moment in their lives where they came to really deeply know Our Lady, the Blessed Virgin Mary, as their mother, and accept her personally, really as their mother in a very profound way. This does also seem to happen very clearly in the life of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. This is actually before her conversion to the Catholic Church. It was, I would say, leading up to it. It certainly seems, and just to continue on with a little bit of what she wrote about this, praying the Memorare and really feeling that she had a mother in the Blessed Virgin Mary. She says, I felt I really had a mother, which my foolish heart so often lamented to have lost in early days. From the first remembrance of infancy, I have looked in all the plays of childhood and wildness of youth to the clouds for my mother. And at that moment, it seemed as if I had found more than her, even in tenderness and pity of a mother. So I cried myself to sleep in her heart. That's a beautiful image. And it goes on to say here about this, it says, these are extraordinary words from a woman who, as a devout member of the Protestant Episcopal Church, just days or weeks before had no concept of Mary as either universal mother or mediator of grace. It is true that her grief for her husband, her loneliness, and her deep maternal instinct made her especially receptive to the maternal solicitude of Mary, but her instant responsiveness and accurate grasp of Mary's role in redemption suggest an exceptional grace of major importance. Certainly, Mary was to play a special role in her own conversion and perfection, as well as in the establishment and devotion of her apostolic community. This is in a chapter of the book entitled Our Lord and Our Lady. Again, this book very much unpacking the spiritual portrait of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. Sister Betty Ann McNeil, any thoughts on her relationship with Our Lady, in particular that writing, that moment that she talks about first finding the Memorare and praying the Memorare?
Yes, I think Mary was a prism of faith for Elizabeth Seton. And when she writes about the Memorare, she actually copied the Memorare at least 3 times. And on one of the times, at the last line, she has, "Love me, my mother." And I think that's very touching from a maternal perspective. But at the same time, we don't know immediately a day before or a day after. She had been in Florence and visited the Church of Santa Maria Novella, where there is a very large life-size painting of Mary receiving the body of her son as he's taken down from the cross. Elizabeth stood there for ages, and she said that afterwards, that image stayed with her for a long time and kept coming back to her. I believe at that moment, she connected with Mary as a mother of sorrows. And Elizabeth at that moment was a new widow in a foreign country with an 8-year-old child, and she didn't speak Italian. So I really believe that the sorrowful mother was someone that she felt a bond and a kinship with, in addition to Mary as a mother and a maternal figure. A few weeks later, she went to the shrine of Our Lady of Grace at Montenero, which is a beautiful shrine overlooking the Ligurian Sea, I believe it is. And there, she had a Eucharistic experience, an experience of the real presence, which she had not known before. And she responded to the rude words of someone speaking English rudely in her ear, saying, "That's what they call the real presence." And she immediately knelt and said, "My Lord and my God," and then began praying with some words of St. Paul. Do they not recognize this is Jesus, their Lord and Savior, that they are receiving? It was an instantaneous moment of belief and faith in Jesus in the real presence, and that stayed with her, and that became a focus while she was in Italy and as she returned, because she had always had a devotion to receiving Holy Communion in her Episcopal Church. But at that time, the concept or belief in transubstantiation had not come to the Atlantic shores, to the Episcopalian community in New York, which had cut ties with the Anglican community or the Episcopal Communion in England, the Church of England. So she was a member of the Protestant Episcopal Church of New York, which received Holy Communion as symbolic representation of the body and blood. So she had this sense, this deep experience of belief, and then she began to ask many questions of the family she was staying with, first out of curiosity and then out of real and genuine interest, trying to sort out the truth. And she saw it and understood it. And that opened the whole gamut of long-term discernment and prepared her for all the opposition that she would face when she came back to New York and told her family and friends that she was thinking about this, because she was the victim of religious bigotry, very much so. And Catholics were not appreciated. And it was as if she were rejecting the family. So her actual decision was delayed for months while she pondered, prayed, consulted, studied the Catholicism. And she consulted the VIPs of that era, Francis Matignon of Boston, John Chevreuse of Boston, and Bishop John Carroll, among others.
Yeah, what an incredible time. So, yeah, I mean, we're talking colonial times here, right? So this is around the time of the American Revolution when she's born, 1774, in the British colony of New York at the time. And so she does marry her husband, William McGee Seton, for love, and she enjoys much happiness with him, embracing her vocation as wife and mother of 5 children. And then it is when they're in Italy and her husband is ill that her husband dies in her arms. And then this is when all of this unfolds that Sister is sharing with us here. She becomes awestruck when she realizes that Catholics believe that God is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. She has profound encounters with grace, identifying with Mary, the sorrowful mother, the Eucharist, drawing her deeper. But then, yes, this return to New York, which at the time, colonial America, very anti-Catholic, but there was a safe haven that you could find in the colony of Maryland to some degree, in Baltimore especially. This was more to be a Catholic colony, at least that was sort of how it began. It also, though, grew to be a very anti-Catholic place as it developed, but still, this would have been more favorable than other places. What is it that, share with us how she was led to Baltimore, and then how she really got into this call to enter into religious life, and not only religious life, but to found an apostolic community, and all that would unfold there.
I would say it certainly was not her game, her plan. However, it was divine providence. Once she professed her faith in the Catholic Church in New York, it was very difficult for her to get a job. And she had these children, and one was quite young. No one would hire her, and she really would like to have taught because she had some experience in homeschooling her in-laws who were minors and her own children. And she did get a job teaching, but the school went bankrupt within 3 months before the students ever arrived. So by divine providence, Father William Dubourg, was passing through New York on his way to Boston on a fundraising trip for St. Mary's school in college in Baltimore. And he was a Sulpician priest. And he saw her potential. He saw her devotion, her piety, her devotion. But he spoke with her and heard her story and realized that this was an educated, literate woman who was now a Catholic and could be used to help teach, to spread the faith. And the Sulpicians and the clergy of colonial America were trying to create and build up the Catholic Church, Catholic families. And if you educated young girls, then you were educating future good mothers who hopefully would raise children who would be faithful Catholics and maybe consider the priesthood. That was part of building up a native clergy. So he had this idea of starting a school in Baltimore for girls because he had already established St. Mary's College for boys. And he invited her to move down and said, we have a home there you could live in, you could teach, we could provide some land if you wanted to build. Oh, he promised everything practically without consulting his community or the bishop. which I think is very interesting. But Elizabeth sought consultation, and she had really wanted to go to Canada because of a Sulpician academy up there, and she thought maybe she could teach there. But that school burned down, so that was not an alternative. And so she, after prayer and consultation, she decided to come to Baltimore, and her brother-in-law paid for her ticket on the boat with the girls. The boys had already been sent down to Georgetown Academy, Georgetown College at that time, kindness of Bishop Carroll and Antonio Felici. So when she arrived in Baltimore, she arrived in a Catholic setting on a Catholic campus, if you will. And it was the first seminary in the United States for formation of priests. She arrived the day they were dedicating the chapel. And by chance, one of her priest friends was there from Philadelphia. And he had a seminary, a young man who was discerning vocation. They wanted the young man, Samuel Cooper, to see the seminary. And they accompanied Mrs. Seton down to Georgetown to pick up her two sons. And one thing led to another, and months later, Samuel Cooper fessed up and said, well, you see, he really was a retired sea captain, so he had some money in the bank.
We're going to have to be right back. We'll be right back. Hold on. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Sister Betty Ann McNeil. We are talking about this great book entitled Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, a spiritual portrait, the second edition, newly published by Ignatius Press. You can get it at ignatius.com. And Sister Betty Ann McNeil has provided the newly edited version for us here, as well as the foreword to this second edition. So very grateful for that, and very grateful to have her with us. We're going to get right back to what she's sharing with us today. But first, I do want to remind you about iCatholic Mobile. It's the only Catholic mobile phone company in the U.S. today. When you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you do help fund the Station of the Cross. Check out iCatholic Mobile, iCatholicMobile.com. Sister Betty Ann, please continue on with what you were sharing with us before the break.
When Elizabeth arrived in Baltimore, shortly thereafter, Father Michael Hurley and his young friend Samuel Cooper accompanied her to Georgetown to pick up her children. And Mr. Cooper learned her story, etc. And a few months later, since it was a retired sea captain and had money, he had to empty his bank account, shall we say, in order to go forward at that time for the tonsure and the priesthood. And he told Father Dubourg that he would really like to start a Catholic school and have a whole continuum of services for people in need, but that it had to be near Emmitsburg, Maryland. In other words, near Mount St. Mary's College of the Sulpicians. Bishop Carroll was not happy because he thought there would be another school for girls in Baltimore. Nevertheless, Cooper bought land in Frederick County, Maryland for Elizabeth Seton and funded the beginning and the foundation of the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, of which she became the mother. And they established St. Joseph's School, which had two programs, one for day pupils in the area and one for boarding students, and thereby earned tuition that would pay for the care of the children who were charity cases, shall we say, and orphans. And that was the beginning of the Sisters of Charity. The Sulpicians had suggested to Elizabeth Seton, as a widow with children, that the best model for a community would be the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul that he and Louise de Marillac had established in France in 1633, because that was a non-cloistered apostolic community, and there were widows who were members. So Elizabeth Seton, through the help of the Sulpicians, obtained the rule of St. Vincent de Paul and they made a few slight adaptations when they translated it to be applicable to the United States. So Elizabeth Seton was a Vincentian woman, a notable Vincentian woman, but she was the first person to implant or inculcate the Vincentian charism in the United States, in North America, before the priests and brothers of the Congregation of the Mission would arrive later from Italy. So the Sisters of Charity followed the Vincentian tradition, and other communities evolved from the roots here in Emmitsburg, and those communities are united with some others of the Vincentian tradition in the Sisters of Charity Federation, and they sponsor the National Shrine of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, where there will be a big 50th celebration this weekend with outdoor concerts, liturgy presided by the Archbishop of Baltimore, and another by the Superior General of the Congregation of the Mission, who traveled from Rome, Italy for it. There are activities for families, children and adults of all ages. It's going to be a really big 50th Jubilee bash this weekend, starting September 12th, 13th, and 14th, including a candlelight concert outside under the stars. And we are sure Elizabeth Seton will provide beautiful weather for us, just like she did on the day of canonization.
Yes, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, Sister Betty Ann McNeil is with us, and the remains of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton are also there. They rest beneath an altar in her honor in the Basilica of the National Shrine of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton in Emmitsburg, Maryland. So a very special place, and so yeah, just to just give some of the finer points towards what Sister was laying out there. That she did Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, so she pronounced her vows privately before Archbishop John Carroll on March 25th, a wonderful date, the Feast of the Annunciation, 1809, and he gave her the title Mother Seton. And so she was off and running at age 35 with a group of young women between the ages of 18 and 26 as the founding members of the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, the first Catholic sisterhood native to the United States. And then so they go to this purchased property near Emmitsburg, and they formally begin then electing Mother Seton as the leader. They formally begin July 31st, 1809, making the education of girls an apostolic priority. And she's still at the same time, so she's a religious mother, but she still is a natural mother of a family to her children. And she has daughters that are there, and sadly, the two of her daughters were among the early deaths at Emmitsburg, 16-year-old Anna Maria in 1812 and 14-year-old Rebecca in 1816. Very difficult for Elizabeth. And at the same time, she had this love, this great love of God, this great love of God's will, this great trust in him, even as she comes up against these great difficulties and trials. There's a chapter in the book, an entire chapter called If You Would Be My Disciple. And it says here, Elizabeth Seton understood from the beginning the necessity of taking up her cross and did so willingly. She learned early that the cross was the mark and abiding providence of Christians, and she did not back down from it. This is one of the hallmarks for me in discovering her through her writings a bit more in this book, is that such a tenderness, such a compassion, as Sister was sharing with us earlier, and at the same time a certain toughness, I would say a very heroic level of fortitude in this very tender, compassionate woman. A beautiful, saintly, holy combination that we have here in St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Sister Betty Ann, anything you'd like to share about that?
Yes, Elizabeth Seton was a courageous woman. It's not a plastic statue or a bobblehead. but she was a courageous woman of faith who acted out of her own agency and had a relationship with Jesus, had a relationship with God, her Father, and trusted the Holy Spirit to lead and to guide her. She saw what needed to be done. She had management and administrative skills, as well as basic nursing skills. And I would say she was probably a pretty strict schoolmistress from reading observations that she wrote about management in the classroom. I don't think I would like her to have been my principal. Of course, I was never a teacher. But she was someone who was very competent as well as very compassionate. And not only did she have to bury 2 of her children, but she also had to bury 2 of her sisters-in-law who were young women that joined her, who had been children when her father-in-law died, and her husband was the oldest of 13 children. So she and he had to take in all the younger Seton children who were minors. So she really, in one sense, buried 2 natural children and 2 who were her in-laws but had been like foster children to her. That's very, very difficult for any parent to bury a child. So that's why I say she's a woman for all seasons, and she's someone who is a role model for courageous compassion as well as apostolic action. And she lived her discipleship not with a flair, but with steadiness and determination. Her eye was on eternity. She said she looked up to the clouds, and what she was doing, she was asking for divine help. So she's someone who I just think is a model for the people of God today. And she is an intercessor. She's our friend in heaven. And through the work at the National Shrine of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton in Emmitsburg, which is located between Baltimore and Washington near Gettysburg, these are holy grounds. And to visit, you're walking on the grounds that Elizabeth Seton walked, and where she prayed, and where she worked, and where she died. So it's a valley known as St. Joseph's Valley from Mother Seton's time, but it's a valley that visitors say exudes peace. It's also beautiful.
Wow, and why was it called that from her time, St. Joseph's Valley? So that's how she would have known of it. Why is that?
Because the survey of the land of Frederick County, the founding, one of the early pioneers that came from St. Mary's City on St. Mary's County up here, saw the land, and there was sort of a mountain. It's not a mountain like out west, but it's a mountain. He named it St. Mary's Mountain, and the land extending below was St. Mary's Valley. When Mother Seton came to where the land was for her, which is a half a mile away, we are in a sub-valley. So if you thought of a little town that has one stoplight and then there's a highway at the other end, you go downhill. So it's a sub-valley, and she named it St. Joseph's Valley. She had a devotion to St. Joseph as a foster father of Jesus, and she had a beautiful painting that is still preserved of St. Joseph. So she named the land St. Joseph. She named the house they built to live in St. Joseph House. The house we live in today in the same land as St. Joseph House. So that's why it was St. Joseph's Valley and St. Mary's Mountain, otherwise known as Mount St. Mary's.
Yes, yeah, incredible. Wow, this is wonderful. Yeah, a wealth of information here with Sister Betty Ann McNeil. Again, the book, Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, A Spiritual Portrait. You can get it at Ignatius.com. My favorite chapter, and a chapter that was a difficult chapter for me to get through because I kept stopping and just wanting to spend so much time thinking about the quotes in this chapter. It's entitled Prayer of the Heart. And you get this sense of, yes, she had this sense of eternity that was so strong. And I think going along with that, this sense of the presence of God, and that this was really a very strong pillar, I guess you could say, in her prayer life. This recognition, this understanding of the presence of God. She writes of it this way at one point. She writes, "The best means to increase the love of God in our heart, which would make the practice of the presence of God so easy to us, is to consider him as our tender Father. Our look of love at him draws back a look of love on us, and his divine look enkindles that fire of love in us, which makes us remember him continually." So you see this very real, ongoing, living relationship with God, and she talks about it. And in this chapter, we get a lot of different quotes where it's described to us what her prayer life is like, various dispositions of her heart, with the actual rule of her community, the prayer rule of her community laid out in this chapter as well. Very interesting, beautiful stuff. And we'll get back to more of this in a moment, but what a blessing. We have the communion of saints. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, pray for us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Sister Betty Ann McNeil. She has edited this new second edition, recently published by Ignatius Press, of the following book, Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. And this is a spiritual portrait. That's what it's called. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, a spiritual portrait. And it certainly is that. Highly recommended. Ignatius.com is where you can find it. Ignatius.com. And I do want to just share with you real briefly the rule of the sisters of the religious community that Mother Seton was leading. It says here that this order of regularity that Mother Seton insisted on from the first, the regulations including rising at 5 o'clock in the morning prayers and meditation, walking to Mass at St. Joseph's Church in town or St. Mary's Church on the mountain, and reciting the Rosary on the way back. The day went on with sacred scripture and the spiritual combat read at meals, examines of conscience, visits to the Blessed Sacrament, spiritual reading, work, and recreation. Very beautiful generosity in living out this interior life, but also the active life in this active apostolate that they had. And she would write this about that. They were not cloistered nuns. These are religious sisters that are apostolic. Their work is still in the world, even though they are somewhat retreating into a life of very generous prayer at the same time. But she wrote this, which I thought was very interesting to think about. She wrote, "If the contemplative Magdalens, meaning those who are cloistered, enjoy more sweetness, they do not possess more merit." It says here, Elizabeth stated bluntly. She goes on to say, "One who runs over a whole city, carrying God in their thoughts, is much more pleasing in his sight than another who lets their thoughts run about while they are kneeling in an oratory." My sense here is not that it's not saying one is better than the other. They go together. They complement one another, the active and the contemplative life. But I think what she's saying here is do not think any less of the active apostolic life that we are leading. We are striving to do this in such a way that it is completely soaked in the presence of God and for God's glory, and that we are carrying God in our thoughts as we go about our work. And this is why, again, that this generous rule of prayer in the community, to make sure that that they really are striving to live it from the inside out. And she also mentions in here, which is, I think, a very practical point, that to beware that we're not going to our prayer as a burden and then leaving our prayer and as like, now I'm free of it and I'm done doing that and I can get on to the things I want to do. No, enter into the prayer with a desire to be with God and to spend time with him. And that's what this is all about, right? To really soak in his presence. And she talks about the great value of silence in his presence. A beautiful sense of prayer she had. I would say that even just by itself is very much worth reading this book, picking up this book and reading this chapter on prayer of the heart. Still so much more for me to spend in this chapter, spending time with it, unpacking it, allowing God to show me how to incorporate this more into my own life. And it's there for you too. Again, the book Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, A Spiritual Portrait, Ignatius.com. Sister, anything else you'd like to share on it?
Yes, I would like to add that this book is also available from the store of the National Shrine of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, from the gift shop. Elizabeth Seton, I would say, was an intuitive woman who nurtured interiority, but rose to the occasion when any external task had to be done. She made clothes for her children. She translated works of Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac to use as instructions for her sisters. She was just such a competent woman and a vivacious woman who was very engaging. And friendship and relationships was her cup of tea. And people remember her that way, and the parents of the children that she taught remember her that way. She's a wonderful role model for teachers, educators, anyone in a service-related ministry. She's known as a precursor of the Catholic school system. She's not the founder of it. But she also was like a hospice volunteer, and she said she closed the eyes of many of her friends and relatives and people in town. She was multi-talented and could multitask, but she maintained a relationship with God, and she knew for whom she was working and why she was working. And she longed for eternity, which was union with God, but she also envisioned a family reunion, of reuniting with her father, her mother, her husband, her deceased children, etc., which is very human.
Yes, it is. And the line that really jumped out to me as sort of encapsulating everything with respect to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton for me at this point is the following. She writes, "I abandon myself to God continually, and I invite all my dear companions to do the same." And I'm sure, she's still inviting us to do the same, to abandon ourselves to God continually. And it was a great pain for her. Her sons, so Richard died of typhus at 25 after tending to the sick on the coast of Liberia. Her son, William, he served in the U.S. Navy, ended up living to the age of 71. 7 of his children lived to adulthood. The last direct descendant died in 1967. Sister, is it William that she was fretting about so often, that she wrote about, even saying was her favorite, but that she was very concerned about him leaving the faith even, and concerned about his soul for eternity, and that was great concern and a great suffering for her. Is that right?
Yes, I would say so. I do think that for some reason William was a favorite. However, he probably had given her good reason to be concerned, and she was concerned about the bad habits, she thought, of the sailors he was with. And he didn't have mother to watch over him. That's basically what she was concerned about. But he turned out to be a very faith-filled husband and father. Unfortunately, was widowed too early, but was a very fine man. And in fact, 2 of his sons fought during the Civil War, and both were injured the same day in the Battle of Antietam. And one of them was shipped back to New York for medical care. And when he came to, he looked up at the nurse and he said, "You probably know my grandmother." And she said, "Well, who was your grandmother?" "Mother Seton." So it was a Sister of Charity in New York that nursed him back to health. Yes, she worried about her boys, and Richard was not as sharp and responsible as William. And Richard may have had some slight learning disabilities because when he was born, he had to be resuscitated. He was not breathing. So he may have had some minor brain injury that may have impacted in his emotional development. But look, he died as a result of an act of charity. And her daughter, Catherine, entered the Sisters of Mercy at the tender age of 45 or so, and did prison ministry at Sing Sing in New York for 46 years before she died at the tender age of 91. And Elizabeth worried about her health as a child. So God had his eye on Elizabeth Seton, and she's a friend of ours, and she can be a friend to anyone, and it interests us. So I'm grateful for the chance to share her story with you.
Yes, it's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, Sister Betty Ann McNeil, and her spiritual director, Father Simon Gabriel Barute, wrote the following after her death. He wrote, "It seems to me impossible that there could be a greater elevation, purity, and love for God, for heaven, and for supernatural and eternal things than were to be found in her," end of quote. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, pray for us. And as the 50th anniversary approaches, September 14th, let's celebrate it well and get to know her more. God bless you all.